Dr. Martin Harris is flying on a plane with his wife Elizabeth. They are heading to Berlin for a biotechnology conference where Martin is scheduled to give a presentation. After landing, the couple hailed a taxi. Martin didn't notice that he left his briefcase near the airport. Martin will have a very tight schedule in the coming days, but despite that, he promised his wife to visit the exhibition with her. The couple arrived at the hotel. While Martin was dealing with the luggage, Elizabeth went to the reception. Martin discovered that his briefcase was missing, just as Elizabeth encountered some issues with her reservation. Seeing her husband getting back into the taxi and leaving again, Elizabeth was puzzled. Martin intended to retrieve the lost briefcase from the airport. However, since there was no mobile network, he couldn't inform his wife. As there was traffic jam on the road, Martin asked the girl driver to take a different route. Suddenly something fell out of the truck ahead. In order to avoid a collision, the driver sharply turned the wheel, and the car went off the bridge, falling into the river. Martin hit his head hard. The driver broke the glass and managed to escape from the car, which was rapidly sinking. Martin was unconscious. The girl returned and managed to pull him out of the vehicle. Both of them were rescued. An ambulance arrived. Martin had stopped breathing, so paramedics immediately started resuscitation measures. At that moment, Martin's entire life flashed before his eyes. He was thinking about the beloved wife. After some time, Martin regained consciousness in the hospital. The doctor was saying something to him, but Martin is American and doesn't speak German. Fortunately, Dr. Farge speaks English. Martin remembers his name but doesn't recall the accident itself. The doctor explained to the patient that after the accident, his heart had stopped for several minutes, and he had been in a coma for 4 days. Now Martin is only concerned about where his wife is. The doctors couldn't find any documents with Martin, so they couldn't contact his wife. Martin couldn't remember her phone number or much else. Dr. Farge said it's partial amnesia. Some memories may come back with time, and some may not. Martin is deeply confused. Later, he learned from Nurse Gretchen that no one had reported him missing to the police. Could it be that Elizabeth isn't looking for him? Looking at his wristwatch, Martin recalls fragments of the past. Elizabeth gave him these watches on their honeymoon. Martin also has a book with him, once gifted by his father. Turning on the TV and seeing news about the biotechnology conference, Martin remembered that he was supposed to be there. Despite the doctor's persuasions, Martin immediately signed a refusal of hospitalization. Now his wife is alone in an unfamiliar city, so he must find her. Before the patient left, Dr. Farge left his calling card in case any unwanted symptoms appeared. Martin arrived at the hotel and explained to the receptionist that he had lost his room key and documents. At that moment, Martin noticed the wife and followed her. Since Martin had neither a passport nor an invitation, Herr Strauss, the head of security, didn't allow him to enter the guest area. However, after Martin explained his situation, Herr Strauss agreed to take him to the wife. Martin approached Elizabeth, but she didn't recognize him. Martin doesn't understand what's happening, while Elizabeth continues to insist that she's seeing him for the first time. Furthermore, Elizabeth introduced them to her husband, Dr. Martin Harris, who arrived here for the biotechnology conference. Martin's shock knew no bounds. He tries to understand why this man has appropriated his identity and why Elizabeth is playing these games. Herr Strauss intended to sort it all out. 4 days ago, Martin was not registered on the hotel's surveillance cameras, only Elizabeth. Supposedly, he went to the airport, and then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon also checked into the hotel. It seemed like madness. Martin continues to insist that he is the real Dr. Harris. Any other man is impersonating him. This could be confirmed by Martin's colleague and friend from America, Rodney Cole. The security service called Dr. Cole but got a voicemail. There is one person in Berlin who knows Martin, Professor Bressler. Martin is here because of him. But the thing is, they only communicated over the phone and have never met in person. Herr Strauss was finally convinced that the man who had the accident was not in his right mind when he saw a photo of Dr. Harris on the official website. This is the man who is right now with the rest of the guests. Martin doesn't understand anything. Herr Strauss can't even contact the American embassy right now because it's closed until Monday due to Thanksgiving Day. To avoid being arrested, Martin apologized to Herr Strauss, saying that the doctor had warned him about memory lapses. Martin promised to return to the hospital. Security personnel escorted him to a taxi. But of course Martin had no intention of going to the hospital and asked the driver to stop. Seeing Elizabeth in the window of a restaurant, dining with someone pretending to be her husband, Martin felt a mix of incomprehension and anger. He left a voicemail for Rodney Cole, telling him what was happening. It sounded like complete absurdity. It seemed to Martin that someone was spying on him from a black car. Martin descended into the subway, hearing footsteps behind him. But when Martin turned around, there was no one. Martin continued walking forward, and a man followed him. Frightened, Martin started running and entered the nearest subway car. The man couldn't catch up with him. Martin is trying to understand who he is and what is happening. Martin remembers that he was supposed to meet Professor Bressler in the laboratory, although Martin is no longer sure of his memories. When some memories of the accident returned to Martin, he contacted the agency to find out the name of the driver who was behind the wheel on the day of the incident. But it turned out that the girl didn't have a driver's license. She was an illegal migrant. Martin said that he only wants to thank the girl for saving him. Eventually, a guy named Biko agreed to help. In the meantime, Gina had already found a new job. Now she works as a waitress in a cafe. When she saw Martin, she refused to talk to him. In the end, he was forced to leave with nothing. The only place where Martin can now get answers is Professor Bressler's laboratory. This is where he arrived and saw the pseudo-Martin Harris. The professor was puzzled, not knowing whom to believe among these two Martin Harrises. Both of them recounted the exact details of all their phone conversations with Bressler, which seemed impossible. Martin called the police and asked to arrest the imposter. Then the pseudo-Martin Harris showed his identity card and a joint photo with his wife. Due to shock, Martin fainted. He was taken to the hospital again. Nurse Gretchen gave him a calling card with the contacts of her friend who helps lost people. Dr. Farge explained to Martin that the confusion in his memories is a result of his coma. Perhaps before the accident, he read a lot about Martin Harris, which is why he knows so much about his life. And now after the coma, he is convinced that he is Martin Harris. The patient underwent an MRI of the brain. Suddenly he saw the same man who had previously pursued him in the subway. The man was wearing a medical gown. He immobilized Martin and injected him with something. When the nurse entered, the man took her life. Taking advantage of the fact that the pursuer had gone somewhere, Martin tried to reach for the nurse's scissors, but suddenly the man returned to eliminate any evidence. It was at that moment that Martin managed to break free and escape. Despite the condition caused by the preparation, Martin continued to move forward. The pursuer followed him through the hospital corridors but ultimately lost him. Hiding in an ambulance, Martin drove to another part of the city. The medication has stopped working. Martin wondered who and why is trying to harm Dr. Harris's life. Apparently Dr. Harris is getting in someone's way. Martin called the pseudo-Martin, but without saying anything hung up. Elizabeth was in the room with the person who called himself Dr. Harris. Martin arrived at Herr Jurgen's address, who specializes in finding lost people. Martin informed him that Gretchen was no longer alive. Herr Jurgen was sorry to hear this, as Nurse Gretchen had been so kind to everyone. In the past, Herr Jurgen served in the secret police of East Germany, which he is proud of. Martin told his story. After the attempt on his life, Martin has become convinced that he is not crazy. Now he wants Herr Jurgen to help prove that he is in. Herr Jurgen believes that Elizabeth is directly involved in this, but Martin refuses to believe it because they loved each other so much. Perhaps she was threatened. Whoever is behind this, they had planned it for a long time because they have documents, family photos and everything else. Mr. Jurgen was skeptical of this theory, as no one could have foreseen the accident. Besides, what is the purpose of all this? What does Elizabeth gain by denying the existence of her husband? It all sounds implausible. Nevertheless, Herr Jurgen promised to help. The first thing he will do is contact Rodney Cole from America. Martin promised to pay Herr Jurgen a reward later, but he only took money to cover expenses and told Martin to find the taxi driver again. That's exactly what Martin did. Gina is still not willing to talk. Martin knows she is illegal and fears deportation from the country. So, when she offered her his watch worth at least $5,000, Gina agreed to talk to Herr Jurgen later. She also allowed Martin to stay overnight at her place. Meanwhile, Jurgen began his investigation. Martin told Gina what had happened. He and Elizabeth had been married for 5 years and were very happy. Gina lives in an old building without an elevator. Her apartment is very modest. Tonight Gina is going to work, so Martin will be here alone. Jurgen continues to study all the available information, focusing on the details. In addition to Professor Bressler, the Nobel Prize winner in biology, Dr. Martin Harris was supposed to attend a reception in honor of Prince Shada, who had recently survived another assassination attempt. Martin saw Gina's drawings, who turned out to be a fantastic artist. The girl shared that she is saving money to move. She dreams of getting documents and leaving far away. Selling the watches will help her fulfill the dream. There was a knock at the door. It was Biko, Gina's friend who helped her with work. He gave her the keys to his car. After the guy left, about a minute later while Martin was taking a shower, the same pursuer burst into the apartment with his men. They knocked Gina out and searched for Martin, who had hidden on the roof. The mercenary was going to inject Gina with some medicine, but at that moment she regained consciousness and began to fight back. Hearing the noise, the mercenary grabbed Gina. Within a few seconds, Martin attacked him from behind. Taking advantage of this, Gina escaped while the men were fighting. On the staircase, Gina saw Biko lifeless. Hearing footsteps, she hid. During the fight, the mercenary deprived Martin of oxygen. Gina approached from behind and administered that same injection to the mercenary. Martin demanded the mercenary answer who he was, but the man quickly passed away. Martin and Gina hurriedly escaped from the house, got into Biko's car and drove away. Suddenly a black car blocked their path. Martin and Gina headed in the opposite direction, but the black car was on their tail the whole time. The pursuit continued through the city streets. The black car repeatedly rammed the fugitives in an attempt to force them off the road. Suddenly the car flipped over at full speed. Seeing an approaching train, Martin and Gina barely managed to escape. The train rammed the car. Martin and Gina entered the nearest bar to hide. In a burst of emotion, Gina slapped Martin because of whom she had lost her friend and all her money. Martin assured that he had never seen those people before. However, Gina guesses who they are dealing with. People from a government agency had taken her parents and brothers from her in the past. Now their only way out is to disappear. Leafing through the father's book, on pages of which there are some addresses and numbers, Martin tried to remember. It looked like a cipher. He promised Gina that he would make things right. The next day, they met with Jurgen. There is no doubt that Professor Bressler and Schade are connected because the latter sponsors the research of the scientist who aims to end hunger worldwide. Extremist groups are unhappy with Prince Schade's involvement in this. But despite numerous threats, he does not back down from his position. Today, before Professor's presentation, there will be a small reception attended by the prince as well. And it is clearly advantageous for the terrorists to appropriate Martin Harris's identity in order to come there and carry out the assassination attempt on the prince. Martin intends to find Elizabeth, knowing that the people holding her are following his schedule exactly. Despite the risk, Gina agreed to participate in this. She kept an eye on the pseudo-Martin, who was in the restaurant. When he got into a taxi, Gina followed him. Remembering that he and his wife were planning to visit the exhibition, Martin went to the gallery and saw Elizabeth there. A man was constantly trailing her. Martin received a message from Gina that the understudy was already on his way. Waiting for Elizabeth to be alone, Martin finally managed to talk to her. However, Elizabeth continues to insist that they are strangers. Martin realized that his wife was intimidated. That's when Elizabeth stopped denying that they were husband and wife. According to her, if they leave together now, it will be the end for both of them. Elizabeth also mentioned that it had to do with the briefcase he left at the airport. They agreed to meet there. When Gina arrived, she saw Martin and Elizabeth kissing. For some reason it upset her. After telling Martin that she loves him, Elizabeth left. Martin knows that his wife is in danger, but he can't act recklessly. Meanwhile, Jurgen received photos from airport security showing Martin and Elizabeth together. Rodney Cole, who supposedly is a longtime friend of Martin Harris, arrived in Berlin. Jurgen and Cole arranged to meet. Cole didn't keep Jurgen waiting long. After looking at the apartment, he immediately realized that Jurgen had served in the Stasi. Rodney Cole is interested in why Jurgen agreed to help Martin. Jurgen already knows that he's dealing with a person from Section 15, a group of mercenaries based throughout Europe. They work for anyone who pays well. Jurgen, who is already terminally ill, realized that Cole wouldn't let him live. That's why Jurgen had added cyanide to his coffee. In the last seconds of his life, he asked Cole what they would do if Martin remembered everything. Meanwhile, Martin and Gina arrived at the airport. Gina was acting as a translator. Martin was able to recall the combination code to his briefcase. Inside was his passport. After checking the documents, the airport employee returned Martin's luggage to him. The passport stated the name, Martin Harris, a US citizen. There was also a joint photograph of him with Elizabeth. Martin stopped understanding who he was. Gina said it wasn't safe to stay here, but Martin intended to wait for Elizabeth. Gina and Martin's paths must part ways forever now. Gina still fears that Elizabeth deceived Martin and led him into a trap. He only thanked Gina for everything. She took the money but gave him the watch back, a gift from his wife. Suddenly Rodney Cole appeared. Martin still believed they had been friends for 15 years. Rodney was here supposedly to help him. But when Martin was about to get into the car with him, he was knocked out with a stun gun. Gina witnessed this. Without much thought, she hijacked a taxi and followed the black car. Martin was brought to some abandoned building and thrown out of the car. Rodney Cole asked him if he seriously believed he was Martin Harris. Martin doesn't understand what's happening. Rodney Cole explained that the understudy himself is not really Martin Harris either. There is no Martin. It's just a legend made up to infiltrate the conference. According to Cole, Elizabeth is not Martin's wife but part of a team of professional mercenaries. Now she has to work with the understudy. That accident interfered with their plans. As a result of amnesia, the person who invented Martin Harris took it for his real life. Receiving the briefcase with fake documents, Cole could be sure that their cover wouldn't be blown. Of course, Cole couldn't afford to leave Martin alive, even though he was the best among the mercenaries. At the last moment, Gina arrived and saved Martin. In the briefcase, Martin found many fake documents proving that he and the one who now calls herself Elizabeth constantly changed identities and appearances. So Cole was telling the truth. Martin, who doesn't know his real name, realized that he is one of the terrorists. The entire biography of Martin Harris is a fabrication. He and his partner were in Berlin 3 months ago and planted a bomb in the room where Prince Shada will stay today. Gina told Martin that the past no longer matters. What matters is the choice he makes now. Meanwhile, Prince Shada arrived at the hotel. He was immediately surrounded by journalists. The prince was escorted to the hotel. Elizabeth and Dr. Harris personally greeted him. Professor Bressler was the organizer of this event. Martin and Gina were going to thwart the mercenaries. Elizabeth discreetly placed a special flash drive in Professor Bressler's bag and went to a room, downloading the data to the hard drive. Security detained Martin and Gina, who were trying to break inside, while Elizabeth continued copying. Martin told the head of security that there was a bomb in the room, but Herr Strauss didn't believe him and thought he was crazy. Elizabeth finished her work and activated the timer. An explosion was set to occur in 5 minutes. Elizabeth similarly discreetly took the flash drive from Professor Bressler's bag. Seeing on the surveillance cameras that 3 months ago Martin and his pseudo-wife had already been in the hotel under different identities, Herr Strauss realized that the man in front of him was not crazy. An alarm sounded, urging everyone to evacuate the hotel urgently. The understudy told his accomplice that he would take care of Bressler himself and ordered her to leave. But she intended to deal with the bomb, or her face would be forever linked to the explosion. Martin suspected that the mercenary's target was not the prince but Bressler. In the wrong hands, his innovative research could be worth billions of dollars. Martin and Gina fled from the security personnel, while the understudy was about to take the professor's life. But Martin thwarted him at the last moment. A fight broke out between them. Elizabeth tried to deactivate the bomb but didn't make it in time. An explosion occurred. Elizabeth was at the epicenter. At that moment, Martin remembered how they had all planned this operation. Their main objective was to download files from Bressler's hard drive. It was meant to appear as if Prince Shada was the primary target and the professor became an accidental victim. The mercenaries had prepared meticulously for this mission. However, Martin wanted to put an end to it and took the understudy's life. Gina witnessed it. She was genuinely scared at that moment, but Martin would never harm her. Gina took his hand. The worst was behind them. They left the partially destroyed hotel together. Firefighters and rescuers arrived at the scene. Herr Strauss stared in shock at the devastation. Shortly after, Professor Bressler, in the presence of Prince Shada, announced his development of the world, a fast-growing grain variety, resistant to drought and cold. It was available to everyone without a patent. It was a gift from Prince Shada and science to humanity. Gina finally received her documents. Now she was Claudia. Her companion took the name Henry Taylor. Together they left the country.